everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am sharing some thrifted makeovers inspired by high-end decor. So whenever I find high-end decor that I love, I like to make a little board in Canva so that when I'm shopping at my local thrift store, I can keep a lookout for similar pieces that I can make over. So that is what we are going to be doing in today's video. I went shopping a few times at my local thrift store, keeping an eye out for similar pieces that I could use to recreate those high-end products. So I hope you enjoy today's video, and with that, let's get started. Now, as some of you may know, I am obsessed with bells, and when I saw this dinner bell at Antique Farmhouse, I knew I had to get some. I actually found this bell along with two other bells in the same day at my Goodwill, which I was thrilled about after months of not seeing a single bell. So I picked this up, and I am first off just gonna wrap some painter's tape around the bell part and paint that turquoise handle with some of my black chalk paint. I chose this one because it had a similar shape to the one from Antique Farmhouse. So once I get these coats of black chalk paint on there and it's all dry, I'm taking some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and I'm going over this entire handle to make it that bronze color like the one from Antique Farmhouse. Once I did the handle, I realized it was just a little off from the color of the bell, so I went over the bell as well. This next little project is inspired by this beautiful tabletop clock from Antique Farmhouse. Now, it took me a little bit, but I did find this cute little clock, and I was able to pick this up at my thrift store. So the first thing I had to do was, of course, take this all apart. It had some teeny tiny little screws, and I was very careful to try not to mess it up. So I set that face part aside with all the workings, and I am painting all my pieces with some of my black chalk paint, including the legs and that top little piece. Now, once those were dry, I am going back in with some of my burnt umber paint and a thicker, wider bristled brush, and I'm lightly brushing that burnt umber paint over top of all of the black on all of the pieces. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to be using some of my European Gold Rub and Buff, and depending on what color is underneath this Rub and Buff, it is going to make the tone of it a more richer color for the brown and a darker, deeper gold color for the black. So you're able to get a variation of golds on top of these colors and give it a more vintage old look. Now, the face of the clock from Antique Farmhouse had some lettering on it. I think it said Old Town and established in 1863, I believe. So I also wanted to age up the face of my clock. So I'm using some of my alphabet stamps, and I'm stamping the face to match the Antique Farmhouse one. This next project is inspired by these linen-wrapped Pottery Barn books. They are $349. Now, whenever I go to the thrift store, I am a huge collector of vintage books. Now, I know you can definitely just paint the covers of your books if they are not the colors that you might like, but I don't like to paint actual vintage books, and sometimes these colors are great, like these red ones and my orange one are great for the fall, so I don't want to permanently cover these. But this Pottery Barn linen cover idea was so great, I grabbed some of my drop cloth. I have a ton of this drop cloth. I always have drop cloth laying around, so I just cut off a few scraps, and I'm just going to make some linen covers for my vintage books. So I started off by just wrapping the drop cloth around my book, and then I will cut it down to fit, leaving just a little bit hanging over all the edges. And like I said, I don't want this to be permanent, so you can see here I'm using some hot glue, but I'm only gluing the drop cloth to itself as I'm folding this over. So I folded over the top and bottom edge first, and then I will fold over the side pieces and hot glue those pieces to the drop cloth. So essentially we are just making linen covers for these books, and as you can see here, I did use a little bit of Scotch tape to tape down the inner flaps so that they'll stay put, but those are easily removable. Now for the excess drop cloth at the spine, I'm just taking a screwdriver and kind of stuffing it down in there because there is a gap between the book pages and the spine that you can fit that down in there. Now at this point, this is what they look like when I was finished covering them, and you can definitely leave them to give them that Pottery Barn look, but I wanted to dress mine up a little bit. So for two of my books, I'm using these Dollar Tree doilies, and I'm cutting those down and just putting those onto that drop cloth, and then I will hot glue the front and the back side to the drop cloth, and then just like I did with the drop cloth cover, I'm tucking those pieces at the bottom and hot gluing it to the drop cloth, and then stuffing the excess in the spine. And then for some of my other books, I'm using some of my Amazon stamps. For some of them, I'm putting the title on the spine and also decorating them with a few of my butterfly stamps or my floral stamps. And for this particular book that had a longer title, I'm using some of my smaller vintage alphabet stamps so that I can fit that going vertically down the spine of my book. You can really decorate these and customize them any way you want, or you can leave them plain just like the Pottery Barn books. It is totally up to you. For this next project, I absolutely adored this little picture from Antique Farmhouse. And of course, thankfully, I already had the perfect picture for this project. You may remember I showed you this picture back in January and said it needed a makeover. So today it is finally getting one. To start off, I'm giving this 2 coats of my black chalk paint, and I'm going to paint the entire outside, but I also did that little piece on the inside too, just that top part, so that when you're looking in it, you won't be able to tell that it was once white. And then exactly like I did with the clock, I'm going to go back over this with a larger brush and dry brush some of my brown umber all over this entire picture, inside and out. Then I'll let that paint dry completely, and I'm going to take this outside and I'm going to spritz it with some Rust-Oleum gold spray paint. I'm not looking to cover it. I am just barely spraying it, holding the can far away. And this is what it looked like once it was dry, and I brought it back in, and I'm going to go over this with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and my stenciling brush. Now, the Antique Farmhouse picture had a vintage kind of engraved in it, so I am going in with some of my letter stamps, and I am going to stamp vintage 1843 on this picture. And since this picture had some lumps in it, I wasn't able to use my stamping block, so I just did each little letter individually without a block. Now, to blend it in and make it look like it was part of the picture, I am just using my stenciling brush with the leftover rub and buff that was on it, and I'm going to go over those stamped letters. This final project is inspired by this vintage wood crate box from Antique Farmhouse. I love these little boxes, really wanted one, and luckily I was able to find this little wood box at my thrift store. It was painted a bright green color, and I went ahead and painted it with 2 coats of my white chalk paint to cover that. And then of course we need to turn this back into wood, so I mixed up some burnt umber, milk chocolate, and a little tiny bit of white paint to make this beautiful color. And then I'm going to grab my paintbrush and dip it in some water. Now, you don't want this paintbrush to be soaking wet because you don't want the paint to drip while you're doing this. You just want that paintbrush to be damp so that it will thin out your paint. So I'm going in and I'm doing one side at a time. I'm going to paint over this entire thing again, keeping my paintbrush nice and wet, but you can see it's not so wet that it's dripping. And then when I finish a side, I'll go back in with a larger brush and brush away any of those paint marks. And if there are spots that weren't dark enough for me, I just went back in with the smaller paintbrush, painted over those, and then did the larger brush again. I continued working around my box, doing that same technique on the top, all the sides, and then I'm gonna let that fully dry before I do the inside. And once it was completely dry, for the fun part, I'm gonna stencil on some wording on here. Now you can choose any wording you want. Most of the vintage boxes I saw were like old company boxes, but you can definitely just do anything you want. For mine, I'm gonna do an antiques flea market. I used a Dollar Tree stencil to do the antique part, and then I'm using my letter stamps to do the flea market. Then I added in just a year, 1802, I think I put. And then for the bottom, I did want to add in a town and a state to make it look authentic. So because I love Halloween and I happen to live near Sleepy Hollow, New York, I put Sleepy Hollow, New York with my smaller vintage stamps. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.